The sky over Valsera bled orange. Crystalline towers, once gleaming under twin suns, now sagged like wax, their molten edges dripping onto fleeing crowds. The Zorati, sleek, amphibious beings with wide, lidless eyes, scrambled over each other in the canals, their terrified clicks and whistles drowned beneath the fire's roar. Their fire suppression drones, elegant spheres of silver alloy, darted uselessly above the flames. Jets of cryofoam hissed into steam before touching the ground. The fire wasn't just burning. It was hunting. High above, in the planetary defense spire, Overseer Crix gripped the console, his bioluminescent stripes pulsing frantic violet. "Signal the evacuation pods! Abandon the eastern districts!" A junior technician, her frilled gills flaring, turned. "Overseer," the humans responded. Crix's dorsal spine stiffened. Humans. Primitive, fleshy things from a death world. What could they? The doors hissed open. Smoke rolled in first, then her, Lieutenant Mara Vasquez, her soot-streaked face half-lit by the inferno outside. She didn't wear a hazard suit. Just a scorched jacket, a tank strapped to her back, and a grin sharp enough to cut glass. "You called for firefighters," she said. "Here I am." Crix gaped. "Your team? Don't need one." She strode to the window. The fire below coiled upward, a living thing, as if sensing her. "You don't understand," Crix rasped. "This isn't normal combustion. It learns. It—" Mara unslung her tank. "Fire's fire. It eats. It breathes. And if you're stupid enough to run, it'll chase you." She turned. "You got a map?" The Zorati exchanged glances. One finally projected a hollow display. Mara studied it, then jabbed a finger at a canal junction. "Here. We cut its oxygen." Crix's frills flared. "That's inside the burn zone." "Yeah." Mara adjusted her respirator. "So stop screaming and get me a damn hose." Outside, the fire roared, a sound almost like laughter. The Zorati Fire Brigade had never seen anything like it. Mara moved like the fire itself, unpredictable, relentless. She didn't douse the flames. She redirected them, using the canals as makeshift fire breaks, herding the blaze into empty sectors. When the drones faltered, she ripped out their coolant lines and jury-rigged them into steam projectors. "You're feeding it?" Kess, a young Zorati fire watcher, clutched his thermal scanner like a talisman. "Starving a fire this big just pisses it off," Mara snapped. "You wanna eat? Fine. But here." She ignited a backfire along a prepped trench. The two flames collided, devouring each other in a snarling whirl. Kess flinched as embers rained down. "It's not working!" Mara didn't blink. "Wait for it." The fire recoiled. For the first time, it retreated. A ripple went through the Zorati. They'd never seen fire do anything but advance. Mara wiped her face, smearing soot. "See? It's just heat, fuel, and air. Control 2, and the third obeys." She tossed Kess a torch. "Your turn." His tentacles trembled. I can't. You're Zorati. You evolved in sulfuric vents. This?" She gestured at the flames. "This is nothing." The fire surged suddenly, a tendril lashing at Mara. She sidestepped, letting it graze her arm. The scent of burnt fabric filled the air. She didn't even grimace. Kess stared. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and lit the trench. The fire hissed. Not in rage. In recognition. The heart of the inferno wasn't just hot. It was alive. Mara and Kess stood in the ruins of the central spire, their suits' cooling systems screaming. Before them, the flames coiled into a shape, a towering figure of liquid gold, its eyes 2 black pits deeper than vacuum. "You!" Its voice crackled like splitting timber. "You do not run!" Mara adjusted her grip on the hose. "Yeah. Weird habit. They fear me." The fire gestured at the city. "You understand?" Kess gasped. "It's sentient?" Mara didn't lower the nozzle. Everything that lives wants to keep living. Even fire. The figure leaned down. I could spare this place. If you let me burn elsewhere. Mara's jaw tightened. How many elsewheres? Does it matter? Kes looked sick. You can't bargain with it. It'll just. Mara cut him off. You got a better idea? The fire spread its arms. Or you can try to kill me. But you won't succeed. The hose in Mara's hands was melting. She knew it. The fire knew it. She let it drop. Fine, she said. But we do this my way. The pact was simple. Brutal. The fire would withdraw from the city. In return, the Zorti would designate burn zones, wild sectors where it could feed unchecked. No more hiding. No more fear. The Zorti Council protested. You're asking us to live with this? Mara shrugged. You got forests. They burn. You rebuild. That's how it works. Kes, now standing straight, added. She's right. We've spent centuries pretending fire doesn't exist. Look where that got us. The fire watched, flickering. At dawn, Mara walked alone to the city's edge. The fire waited, a wall of shimmering heat. You could stay, it offered. Teach them. She lit a cigarette off its embers. Nah. They've got Kes now. He is not you. Mara exhaled smoke. He's better. The fire rippled, something almost like laughter. Then, with a sound like a sigh, it peeled away from the towers, flowing back toward the deadlands. Behind her, the Zorti emerged, tentacles entwined, watching the flames recede. Not with terror. With respect. Mara stubbed out her cigarette. Somewhere in the ashes, the fire's voice lingered, just for her. Next time, little pyre. I'll burn brighter. She grinned. Yeah. I'll be waiting. And as the twin suns rose, for the first time in Valsera's history, the city burned no more. The first thing Mara noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound. The air screamed with collapsing infrastructure and distant, panicked Zorti, but the lack of sirens. No alarms. No automated warnings. Just the steady, hungry crackle of flames eating through a civilization that had never learned to fight back. She stepped over a melted drone, its silver carapace warped into a grotesque sculpture. The Zorti Fire Brigade huddled behind a barricade, their bioluminescent stripes dim with fear. Their equipment was pristine, untouched. They hadn't even tried. Overseer Crix rushed forward, his frills flared in distress. Lieutenant Vasquez, you must order an immediate evacuation. The fire is just fire, Mara interrupted. She unslung her pack, pulling out a charred, hand-drawn map. You got water lines under these sectors? Crix blinked. Yes, but... Good. She tossed the map to a wide-eyed Zorti. Shut off the flow here, here, and here. Then open every damn valve in the northern grid. The Zorti hesitated. That would flood the lower districts. Mara didn't look up from strapping on her respirator. Yeah. And? A beat. Then the Zorti scrambled to obey. Crix grabbed her arm. You don't understand. This isn't some primitive chemical reaction, it chooses what to burn. Mara peeled his tentacle off her sleeve. Everything chooses, she said, and walked into the smoke. Behind her, the fire shifted. Kes had never held a flamethrower before. It was heavier than he expected. Colder, too. The metal bit into his grip as he trailed behind Mara, watching her carve a blackened path through the city's heart. She moved like she'd done this 1,000 times, because she had. You're burning more, he accused, voice thin. Mara didn't slow. Controlled burn. Starves the big one. But... A wall of flames surged toward them. Kes stumbled back, but Mara stepped forward, firing a precise jet into its base. The flames recoiled, hissing. See? She knocked her boot against the newly charred earth. Nothing left to eat here. It'll move. Kes's frills trembled. You're treating it like an animal. Mara wiped sweat from her brow. Fire's alive. Just not the way you think. Above them, the drones finally whirred to life, not fighting, but mapping, tracking the fire's retreat. For the first time, the Zorati weren't running. They were learning. Kes tightened his grip on the flamethrower. Then, hesitantly, he aimed at an untouched alley and pulled the trigger. The fire shrieked. Not in pain. In challenge. The negotiation happened in a melted plaza, where the ground was hot enough to blister skin. Mara stood barefaced, her respirator discarded. The fire loomed before her, a column of white-hot hunger, its edges flickering with something almost like speech. You teach them. It crackled. They will forget. Behind her, Kes flinched. Mara didn't. Maybe. But I'll be pissed if they do. The fire rippled. You will not stay. Nope. Then why bother? Mara tilted her head. Why you? A pause. The flames dimmed, just slightly. Kes edged forward. It doesn't know? Mara snorted. Sure it does. Same reason anything burns. She held out her hand, palm up. Because nobody told it not to. The fire coiled around her fingers. Not burning. Testing. Kes held his breath. Then, terms, whispered the fire. The Zorati rebuilt in shifts. By day, they cleared debris. By night, they lit bonfires at the city's edge, small, contained, respectful. Kes oversaw them now, his tentacles scarred but steady as he adjusted the flame's height. You're getting better, Mara remarked, packing her gear. He didn't look up. We'll keep the pact. I know. Crix approached, his stripes no longer pulsing panic. The council wishes to grant you honorary citizenship. Mara zipped her duffel. Pass. You could at least take payment. She hoisted the bag onto her shoulder. Already got it. Crix frowned. What? Out in the Deadlands, the fire burned low and patient. Waiting. Mara smirked. A promise. The shuttle arrived. She boarded without ceremony. As the engines roared, Kes lifted a torch, not in farewell, but in practice, and somewhere, deep in the ashes, the fire watched. Mara's boots hit the molten pavement with a hiss. The Zorati evacuation ships streaked overhead, their engines wailing like frightened children. She didn't bother watching them go. The fire had already taken the eastern districts. Now it coiled through the central spires, its flames licking at the crystalline structures with deliberate precision. Not random destruction. Strategy. A Zorati fire response unit stumbled past, their containment foam evaporating before it left the nozzles. One spotted Mara and made a desperate clicking noise. Run! It's learning, Mara finished, pulling her goggles down. Yeah. I noticed. She reached into her pack and tossed a handful of metallic pellets onto the street. The nearest Zorati recoiled. What are those? Human fire breaks. Mara struck a match. Watch. The pellets ignited with a blue-white flare, burning impossibly hot and fast in perfect concentric circles. Where they burned, the main fire hesitated, then diverted, flowing around the human-made barriers like water around stones. The Zorati's frills stood straight up. How? Mara was already moving. Fire respects strength. And nothing stronger than something that burns hotter. Behind them, the pellets burned down to nothing. The city fire paused, then began testing the edges. Kes found Mara on the observation deck, staring down at the burning sectors. She'd commandeered a holographic display, sketching furious red lines across the city map. You're not fighting it, he realized. Mara didn't look up. Fighting makes it angry. Then what? Teaching. She tapped the display, and 3 new blue lines appeared. These are your water mains. We're going to open them all. At once. Kes's gills flared. That would create a flood, yeah? Mara finally turned. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes reflecting the distant flames. Fire's a living thing. And like any living thing, it needs to breathe, Kes finished. Mara grinned. It wasn't a nice expression. The fire below them roared suddenly, as if it had heard. The control center shook as another spire collapsed. Alarms wailed, then cut out abruptly as power failed. Mara stood before the master valve controls, her hand on the emergency release. The Zorti engineers had all fled. Only Kess remained, his tentacles gripping the console so tightly they'd gone pale. "This will destroy half the city," he whispered. Mara didn't deny it. "Better than all of it." Outside, the fire had begun to change. No longer random tendrils, but concentrated columns, moving with clear purpose toward the remaining population centers. "It's getting smarter," Kess realized. Mara nodded. "Because we're teaching it how to think." A terrible silence fell. Then Mara pulled the release. Somewhere beneath their feet, 1,000 valves opened at once. The flood came roaring through the lower districts, a tidal wave of foaming water crashing through streets and tunnels. The fire recoiled, hissing and spitting, its tendrils retreating up toward the rooftops. Mara and Kess watched from the last standing tower as the water rose. "It's not enough," Kess said. The fire was already adapting, learning to climb higher. Mara checked her oxygen tank. "Never is." Then she stepped onto the ledge. Kess grabbed her arm. "What are you doing?" Mara looked down at the raging floodwaters, then up at the gathering flames. "Finishing the lesson." She jumped. For one terrible moment, Kess saw her silhouette falling, then the explosion came, a deafening blast of white fire erupting where Mara hit the water. The shockwave rippled outward, a perfect circle of superheated steam that smothered the remaining flames in an instant. When the steam cleared, the fire was gone. Only the city remained, broken, flooded, but alive. Kess stared at the spot where Mara had fallen. Then he picked up her discarded toolkit. The fire didn't burn like normal fire should. Mara watched through thermal binoculars as the flames moved against the wind, curling around intact structures only to obliterate others with surgical precision. Behind her, the Zorti command center buzzed with panicked calculations. "Temperature anomalies in Sector 7, a technician called out. Mara lowered the binoculars. "It's hurting survivors." Overseer Crix turned, his bioluminescent stripes pulsing erratically. "What?" She pointed to the thermal display. "See these heat signatures? People clustered here, here, and here. The fire's leaving just enough space between burn zones to funnel them." Crix's frills stiffened. "That's impossible." Mara grabbed a plasma torch from the wall. "Tell that to the fire." She strode toward the exit, ignoring the shouts behind her. The doors hissed open, revealing a wall of heat that made her skin prickle instantly. The fire was waiting. Kess found Mara on the edge of the burn zone, tossing small metallic spheres into the flames. Where they landed, the fire recoiled like a scalded animal. "What are those?" he shouted over the roar. "Fire breaks," Mara answered. "Human design. They burn at 3,000 degrees, hotter than this thing likes." The fire surged suddenly, forming a towering wave of flame. Kess stumbled back, but Mara stood her ground, adjusting a dial on her wrist gauntlet. "Watch," she said, and pressed a button. The spheres detonated simultaneously, creating a ring of blue-white fire that forced the main blaze backward. For the first time, Kess saw something like fear in the way the flames retreated. Mara's grin was all teeth. "Told you it was learning." The control room monitors showed the fire reforming, pulling away from the city center and gathering itself into a single massive column. "It's consolidating," Kess observed. Mara nodded, checking her oxygen tank. "Preparing for a final push." Crix turned from the comms array. "Evacuation ships report the fire is blocking all escape routes." Mara didn't look surprised. "It wants us cornered." Kess's tentacles twitched nervously. "So what do we do?" Mara strapped on her breather mask. "We teach it one last lesson." She tossed Kess a modified flamethrower. "You're with me." The fire outside roared in anticipation. They stood at the city's edge, backlit by the raging inferno. Mara's suit was melting at the seams, her exposed skin blistering from the heat. Kess adjusted his grip on the flamethrower. This won't work. Probably not, Mara agreed. Then she fired. The modified chemical stream hit the fire's core, not extinguishing but changing it. The flames turned an eerie blue, then white, then began collapsing inward. The fire screamed. Not in pain, in understanding. Mara fell to one knee as her equipment failed. Kes dragged her back as the implosion reached critical mass. For one perfect moment, there was silence. Then the fire was gone. Not extinguished, transformed. Mara coughed blood, but smiled at the single white ember that floated down to land in her palm. See? She whispered. Everything burns. The ember pulsed once. Then went dark. Kes looked at the unscorched city. At the survivors emerging from shelter. Then at the human who had fought fire with fire. He picked up the spent flamethrower. And began to rebuild.